here at the Baker Institute. The Mexico Center, as you know, is a center dedicated to the study of the binational relationship and Mexico and public policy. It has truly been an honor for me to direct the center for the last 4.5 years. We're going to be 4.5 years old next month in December. And our activities are speeding up. We're cracking out a lot of research on Mexico, and our media outreach is important as well. Our outreach to the university community and the academic community. We have a number of affiliated scholars that collaborate with the Mexico Center, both here in the U.S. and in Mexico. And one of our most important components is also inviting important persons, individuals, functionaries, former functionaries, and so on, to come and share with us their thoughts. Some of their thoughts have to do with their period in office, and some of them with their own assessment of where Mexico is today, where the binational relationship is today, and where Mexico is going. There's a lot of uncertainty, as you well know, in the binational relationship today. But there's also a lot of uncertainty and challenges in Mexico. So we're never really short of things to think about. And I think one of the greatest challenges in Mexico today is the issue of the rule of law. It's been for decades, and certainly in the last 10, 15 years. And I am convinced that that's one of the reasons why Mexico has been so vulnerable to rhetorical attacks from the now Trump administration. Mexico has got some homework. And I think there is nobody better qualified to explain to us what has happened in Mexico in the last 10 years and 15 years in terms of security, where Mexico is today and where Mexico is going in the future. In fact, over the last half a day, I've had the opportunity to sit down and have conversations with our guest today, and I have learned that he is really thinking very hard about these issues. He's developed his own academic model to try to explain what exactly are the reasons why Mexico is in the situation that it is today, and to sort of outline a path forward for Mexico. So it is my pleasure to introduce today to this private conversation a figure that was a leading person in Mexico and the security landscape in Mexico really since the 1990s. First as an intelligence officer in the CISEN, which is the Mexican CIA, so to speak, for many years. And then, of course, directing the federal police under the Calderon administration, and always engaged in those issues as well. Later in the SSP, which was the Secretariat for Public Safety and Security. And so he had his hand right on the issues that most affected Mexico in the last 15 years. And indeed, I've learned quite a bit from him in the last few hours that we've spent together. And I think it'll be an interesting presentation. This is the way we'll proceed today. Mr. Genaro García Luna will speak for about 45, 50 minutes or so. And then Dr. Guadalupe Correa, who's visiting us from George Mason University, will make some comments and questions for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it to a conversation. It's truly a privilege for us to be sitting around the table to listen to the person who, I think, besides President Calderon, best understands where the situation in security in Mexico was and is today. Please help me welcome Mr. García Luna.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I can't speak in Spanish because I'm more rich in Spanish.
And we have translation, so if you need the equipment, if you don't speak Spanish, there's a little equipment in front of you, so that's fine.
Thank you so much.
Pásale para acá.
Good morning, everybody. Well, thank you so much to Tony. Thank you for having me and for the invitation to have this space. I thank also Rice University to give me this opportunity to do an analysis of the situation with safety and security in Mexico. Without any further delays, I would like to tell you my story. The indication was that I should give you a general vision of what could be a perspective on security and safety for the country and what has been going on for the last 15 to 20 years in Mexico. And probably the last portion of my presentation is going to be the richest portion. But I would like to give you an explanation first. And I would like to show you, first of all, a diagram, something we prepared doing research to explain what happened. And I did this when I was in charge of the secretary. And I just want to give you some context, and I want to explain to you the different parts that have to do with this process. And before I do that, I'm an engineer by profession. And one of my the things that I learned, my training as an engineer, they taught me to look at systems, first of all. I look at all the processes, first of all. And I work in national security. I work counterintelligence for the country. I work in anti-terrorism for the country, too. I was Secretary of State for Public Safety. But my ideas have to do with systems as well. And part of what I would like to share with you, I want to share this approach with you because I want to have like a whole vision of what's going on in Mexico. And in order to do that, I have a presentation that I brought for you. When I was in Mexico working on this particular issue, what we wanted to do was do like a very in-depth review to explain what was going on. And what we found is that in the world there were success instances dealing with this lack of safety, with violence. In other countries where there was a lot of criminal activity, structural problems, some countries were able to deal with this successfully. And at the time we had, for instance, here, the cities of New York, Chicago, Palermo, Medellin in Colombia, for instance. And when we did the research and we looked at the slides, we observed something. It was something really important that we noticed in terms of homicides, for instance. At the time, there was a case in New York, for instance, that showed that the national average was, for instance, 9.4 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, when New York had 30.6 as reference. So in Chicago at the time, it was 33 point something, and national again average was 9.3. Medellin in Colombia had the national average was 86, and look at this. And the country, Colombia, had 86. Medellin as a city, 375 homicides per 100,000 people. So this is a very important issue. Sicily in Italy, for instance, 1.9. That was the average for the whole nation. And Palermo had 14.5. So, however, the differential was really, really broad. And in both cases, New York, Chicago, Medellin, and Palermo in Italy, they dealt with it successfully. And I want to share with you this process. I want to see if we can apply this to Mexico and do a general comparison of the process. This is what happened in Mexico. When we were doing this review, Mexico had at the time, Ciudad Juárez, for instance, it had 206 as the rate. And Mexico as a country had 18.1. So that is something for you to look at the reference. Next slide. Now, we have New York. In New York, you have the trends. This is the first number that you have there. And we see the peak here in 1990. And after 5 years, you have a huge drop in this rate of homicides. It went from 19.3 to 30.7. And then after, a process, it's cut in half. And this trend towards the decreased number of homicides continues. And in Chicago, we have the same. We're talking about violence in Chicago, you look at the numbers and how they moved. We have what we observe here, there's a curve here. It's a very slow curve, but it's an important curve. It's an analysis by the city. If you look at the bottom half of the slide, if you look at the curve, you see how the trend goes down. This is in Colombia. If you can look at the growth that's being generated and the peak of violence that you see here, and look at the trends and how it goes down. And this is very important. 187, then there's an increase, and then the state starts really combating crime. There is the trend goes up. There is more and more homicides until 91, and then in 1999. When we see that the numbers are going up, we look at Colombia, we look at what happened in Cali, and we look at the process. Now, the next one. This is for Palermo in Italy, and look at the numbers and how they go up. There's double the rates, and you have a huge problem, and then it starts dropping. And the next one. So, just in a very brief fashion, there are different reasons for this to happen. In the case of New York, and there was the program, the Zero Tolerance, where you combat even minor crimes. And those have an impact on bigger crimes, and in terms of the statistic for crime. And then there was a re-engineering of the police force in New York. In the case of Chicago, there's a program that's Juntos Podemos, Together We Can. So they created a program with businessmen and different social programs, and also a transformation of the local police force. They did some community work. It was the first time that they did some community work, and it was done totally different from what had been done in the past. In the case of Medellin in Colombia, there was frontal attack on crime. The government started this process, and they attacked the Cali cartel in Medellin, and then after Pablo Escolar, there is a decrease in the incidence of crime, and Colombia generates a different way of dealing with it, and social programs that they generate at the time, working with the communities and working on combating drugs, and by using a different approach, they really lower the numbers. In the case of Italy, in Palermo, the approach was more in terms of the legal system. They worked on the judges and the DAs. They worked with the judicial powers and the magistrates, and there was a problem, very violent problem with judges. Judges were being killed, and what they did there, they decided to empower these authorities. They gave them legal power. And something new that they created, they called it a macro trial in order to combat crime as a whole. And so their approach had to do with the police, and they had to do with the legal system. And when you get then to these incidents of extreme violence, they implemented this very aggressive approach, but violence actually increased at the time, and the numbers increased during those times. In Ciudad Juárez, after doing the analysis, we looked at the numbers, we reviewed the process, and what we see for Ciudad Juárez at the time we were reviewing this, Ciudad Juárez was the most sensitive area in Mexico. In Ciudad Juárez, we had average one out of 3 dead people in the country were in Ciudad Juárez. 70% of the homicides were in Ciudad Juárez. It was incredible. If you look at the numbers, look at the rates. And this is research that was done to kind of find what the origin was for these criminal activities. And then following that, we decided to do something different to counteract this process. And what we did is we looked at the structural aspect. We work with the police force, and we work with criminal activities, and we decided to have a new operational scheme for the police, and also a new approach to look at all the different variables that hadn't been included in the past. We looked at education, we looked at health, we looked at social issues, with experiences like the ones that they had in Colombia, in New York, in Palermo. We tried to learn that, and we decided to combat crime up front. And technically, Juarez, from being the biggest crime city in the country, it became one of the cities that is below average now.
Now, here, what you see on the slide, I was talking about the operational aspect. This is the trend in Juarez. You can see the rates dropping, and it dropped below the national average in number of homicides. And this is very important because Juarez, we did not have an understanding of why that was happening. And what happened was that we had the maquiladoras in Juarez. There was a large population of entrepreneurs and business people, and there were many issues that were not taken care of. There was a lot of economic activity, but there was no consistency as far as, the roads were in bad shape, the infrastructure was in bad shape. For example, at that time, at that time, I was proposing a component, what we call secure corridors or safe corridors, and that was my proposal. What was that about? Well, we had female workers who were living in public housing, and they had to take public transportation, and they were exposed to criminal activities. So we had to prevent that, we had to build a bridge so they would have access to public transportation without going through those dangerous areas. So we were able finally to reduce the crime rates. There was more stability. We really worked a lot on social security, security of the population. Now, you can see now on the slide, these are the homicide rates. This is the trend over time. And this is New York, Chicago, and Medellin in Colombia. And you can see the curves, how the incidence decreased. New York actually had the fastest drop because of some favorable conditions and zero tolerance, and so this prevented the increase in crime. There were very important components, from the business community, and all of that helped to shorten the process. Chicago, it took longer. You can see that the decrease took more time. But again, when some of those components, the social, structural issues, were dealt with, the incidence decreased. And Medellin, you see the same behavior. The difference is the time it took. But they all follow the same trend of decreasing the incidence of crime. Now, to be able to identify what are the key components in the fight against this phenomenon, this is what we consider the key. This is the model for the behavior of all those components that support that trend. You see, when you look at the lower left, you see there is an evolution or an increase in criminal activities. And there's also a deterioration of the structural capacity of the state to fight crime. And also there is the social fabric starts to be affected. That's when violence starts to increase. Now, when the government decides to combat those criminal structures and violence. In all of the cases that we studied, at that point, violence always increases because there's a resistance on the part of the criminal elements. We're affecting their capacity to be profitable, to benefit from crime. So it's kind of like a medication. When you're sick and you start taking medication, there are some side effects, but eventually you regain your health. Now, this happened in New York and Italy, in Chicago. At that point, when the state decided to fight against crime, homicide rates doubled, for example, in Italy. So if we follow the process, the next stage, this is when the government decides to fight crime. It starts working on legal structures, the police structures to combat violence. There's an increasing violence. Now, when does the curve turn and the decrease starts? This is very important. That's when the state is able to deploy its forces in a wider fashion, when they start controlling these criminal structures and taking control. The state begins to take control on the field. For example, in the case of Juarez, we had clean streets, clean, secure corridors. That's when the trend changed. And in all of the cases, what happens is violence decreases at that point, starts decreasing, and there is, again, an upward trend at some point. There's another peak. And it's very important to maintain the rule of law here, because it's like a vaccine when we're talking about health. I mean, the virus is not dead yet, but it's very important for the state to strengthen the rule of law and to strengthen all of those social programs that can combat the origin of this criminal phenomenon. So this is really key. In Medellin, in Colombia, when there was a resurgence of violence, Plan Colombia started, and the trend started dropping. Now, this is Mexico. We can see the evolution, the increase in the homicide rate, 1998 to 2017. 2017, we are projecting 25,000. So it will go above the highest point, the peak that occurred in 2011. So at this point, we have 18,500 homicides, and we're expecting it to grow up to 25,000. This is the official record, official records of what happened in the country since 1998. And this is the same, we see the same trends that occurred in Chicago, New York, Medellin, Palermo. Initially, there is an increase and then a drop when the state starts to take control. Now, these are the light blues, the official record. These are the official records, both by the state, the government in Mexico, and the INEGI. For example, here, INEGI, which is the National Institute, both of them follow the same trend. These are both sets of records. Here we can compare this is the data we have from Mexico, and this is the comparison with other cities, other nations. We see the same trend, the same behavior. In Mexico, 2008 or so, violence started to increase when the state faced this with all the different components. There was another increase 2011. The decrease started when the state actually had the strength to fight it. There had the social programs and institutional capacity to fight this phenomenon. And that's when the decrease starts, up to 2013, almost beginning of 2014. And here comes the important question: why did it start growing again? And you will remember that in the other cities, this didn't happen. Why? Because the rule of law was maintained, the social programs continued to be applied and implemented. In Mexico, the last 6 years, the Secretary for Public Security disappeared. And there were other phenomena that hindered this process. And again, we're starting with the upward trend. So we're again at this point. So because we don't have an integrated system. So it's like a virus. The process starts again. The medication did not complete its job. So the upward trend starts again. So now, what is the proposal? What we have been researching with Tony. I've worked in national security for 25 years. I worked in intelligence, then in counterterrorism activities, and I did all of this research, all these studies of public security. And what I want to share with you, I was I left government, I went into academia, and I continued studying and researching. And this is the first time I come here as a private citizen and not as a member of the government. And I'm very pleased to do this. And this is a proposal that I will also publish in a book, but I want to share this with you. I'm looking at security from a different standpoint, with different focus. To fight this phenomenon, we have to do it in a systemic way. We have to fight with all the components, or against all the components that generate this phenomenon. It's not magic, it's not good luck. It requires a systematic effort. So this is the proposal that we have been developing for this vision. Is a model that joins or links security with well-being. When we talk about security, sometimes we just focus on the tactical aspects, on police, but there are other aspects that are even more important than police itself, and that have a higher impact on this phenomenon. But we don't have the tools to see them, to identify them, to measure them. And for people like me, engineers by training, we say if it cannot be measured, it's not good at all, because we cannot implement a process. And we need a roadmap for this process. So there are three key elements in this process that we're proposing to be able to follow this vision of security with well-being. There are three key elements. One, studying the criminal component, the criminal structure and violence. Second, those direct components or factors that give rise to this phenomenon. And the three indirect components, the social determinants. And I will explain all this. Now, what gives rise to this development of criminal activities? In Mexico, the main factor has been that organized crime has become involved in the small and petty crimes. Now, people who in the past were petty criminals have become members of criminal organizations. And before, we had isolated, people who would just shoplift or steal a purse or rob somebody on the street. Now we have a criminal structure that has a lot more strength, and these people are members of this criminal organization. Now, these criminal groups use extreme violence to maintain internal control and also to deter also, because security is one of the most important elements in society, and when there is insecurity in society, when there's no match, when the society and police authorities are not working together. So again, the basis for security in any country, we need to have an efficient integration of society and the authorities, police authorities. There's no way to have security without that efficient integration, that communication, that link. And this duo, this society, when violence impacts society so much, society gives up actually and stops demanding from the authorities this security. This generates corruption, and institutions get corrupted, and undermines institutions. So that's why this is such an important point, because this extreme violence does not only serve the internal control of these criminal organizations, but it has an impact on this alliance between society and authorities. In the U.S., the most important element against crime is the citizens themselves just denouncing these criminal activities and reporting these criminal activities. So the early detection of crime is achieved then, when the citizens report. There will never be more capacity on the part of the authorities to deploy beyond what society can achieve. Society is there. Society is watching, is observing. If the authority does not have that capacity to take that report and act, or there's no reporting, then they lose their capacity to act. And that happens, that alliance between the state and society is broken when extreme violence inhibits that process. Now, also, the criminal enterprises need a vacuum that's actually is created when society is not reporting crime again. So I don't know if you heard of what we call black holes now, and we have areas where there's prostitution, brothels, there's drug trafficking, and those focus of criminal activity became like the office, the central office, the headquarters of these criminal activities. They can have their own records, their own communications, and so at the local level, they start intimidating society. They're able to carry out kidnappings, etc. That has proliferated because it's very profitable. So that really is an advantage for the criminal enterprises. Now, the next element, the direct components, is something very important. You're all business people. You know this very well. You will understand it clearly.
I'm going to give you an example, and that is so that you can get the concept a little bit easier. I was talking to Tony, I was talking about systems. If we're talking about systems, in order to light a fire, you need three things. You need, something combustible, you need oxygen, and you need something that sparks, or heat, fuel. If you are missing one of these three or four things, you are not going to have a fire. If you have three things, combined, then you have a fire. And that is what nature does. You're going to have a tree that falls down, it dries up, there's oxygen, somebody lights up a cigarette, and poof, you have a fire. So you have the three components. If one of those things is missing, you're not going to have a fire. So the proposal here is that's the way it should happen. As a system, you're going to have three minimum things for it to happen, for violence to exist. And these are the components that you have to them. First of all, you have to have this criminal market, this illegal market. Second, you have to have this crime logistics in place. And in the third place, you have to have a loss in the institutional order. You have to have corruption. If one of these three legs is missing, you are not going to generate violence or this criminal structure. So if you have all three of them, that's what generates crime, as if it was a fire. So as a system, what we need to look at is to take one away. One of the three things, you take it away and you wouldn't have crime. So if I'm working from the government, I need to have the ability to have an effect on one of these things. So I need to work on the components of crime. Nowadays, in Mexico, we have a problem with fuel, for instance. Fuel, you probably heard that. And the approach is they steal a lot of the fuel, gas. And I don't know if who is using the gas, or who's using this fuel that is being stolen? That would be the question. And yeah, they're stealing a whole lot of fuel, but who is the consumer of all this fuel? There is an illegal market. There is a market that is consuming this stolen product. And consequently, there is an offer because there is demand. So, in the past, you have drug traffickers that were involved in this too. And, and you also have the illegal traffic of migrants. So there is an illegal market. And in this illegal market, as a businessman, this has to be a profitable market, and if it's a profitable market, it's going to happen. I was giving you an example. I had a hunter, a friend, and, he was trying to hunt deer, and he says, well, if you have deer, you're going to have hunters. That is supply and demand. You're going to have one because you have the other. And this is the same, and it's true. Where you have hunters, you have more deer. And I thought that was an interesting concept, so I started reviewing this too. And I was talking to this friend that gave me that example, and I wanted to understand, and how is it possible that you have more deer when you have hunters around? Well, whenever you get your permit, you have to pay. You have to pay for 3 deer or 4 or 5 deer. So the people who take care of the land there, since they want more hunters to be on the ground, they make sure there are plenty of deer. So when you have hunters, you're going to have more deer. If there is no market, there is no offer. When it's supply and demand. So you're always going to have supply to meet demand. And you're the experts here. You are the business people. If it's profitable, there is even more supply. So that's why you have to look at the system, the whole system. So you look at each one of the components. And so you can fight them up front. If there is an illegal market, you have the supply. For instance, you have a vehicle company. I'm not going to give you an example with a name. I'm not going to name names, but at one point in Mexico, they were stealing, the backlights, the car lights. And it was like a fashion at the time. Everybody was stealing those because they were being resold in the market. And there was one brand, it was a very prestigious car brand, very expensive, and once they stole the lights from a car, and it was like the most expensive car in the market, and the car, the guy, his lights were stolen. He went back to the car dealer to buy the lights, and the agency just gave the lights to him for free. I don't know. It's the backlights of the car, and that was interesting. He said, well, I thought they were really expensive. I thought they were expensive because it's one of the most expensive car brands in the market. But they gave him the lights for free. So they took them. And the people at the car dealer said, well, we checked, yeah, they had been taken, and we just gave it to him so that we take care of the illegal market, so that they go down in price. And in fact, that made things better because they took away the market. Because if you're stealing those, when they steal your car lights and you go to the dealer and they give them to you for free, the market gets affected. So that was one solution to the problem. You always have to have a market. And that's what we need to make sure it doesn't exist. The second component, you were talking about the crime logistics. So we were talking about the fact that this involves different items. You have to have guns, you have to have a place for it to happen, you have to have communication channels. And in Mexico, this is very important. In 2004, there was a process in Mexico where they allowed people to have automatic weapons. In Mexico, before that, there were a lot of, crime committed with just knives and, handguns and things like that. After 2004, things changed. It sort of got exponentially worse to reach much higher levels, with weapons that were like military-grade weapons. So once you have this frontal combat, and we used to have it with knives and blades and handguns, and now we move to a market where the crime happened with more automatic and military-grade weapons, and that, of course, changed the process. So you have to look at those components. That is what sort of feeds the phenomenon. And the same thing, you have to do an analysis to see these black holes that we were talking about. You have to have the capacity to develop these processes. You have to be able to sell. And the other component is this loss of the institutional order. You need to have that. And this, what happens is the police ends up feeding the problem. And that is a key problem in Mexico. And in Mexico, this is still a very important issue. And this is something that we're going to have to take care of. We're going to have a different model. We're going to have a state vision, so that we can go beyond the political discussion or the party discussion. We have to go beyond that. Safety and security should not be a political discussion. It has to be a state policy where everybody has to be on the same side. Everybody has to be on the side of security. You cannot debate security. It cannot be a partisan conversation. It has to be state policy in which everybody is part of the solution. Everybody is part of this process to get better security. If the government does not assume this responsibility, if they make this discussion a partisan discussion, what happens is what just happened. We have the Secretary of State that is directly responsible for security, and it changes when you have a new government. So you have to change that. We have to start from scratch. And if for instance, it is as if we took, from Treasury, we took the Bank of Mexico away from Treasury, and it is as if we put, that would be the example. So you have to change the process. And those are things that have to happen. And these are things that have been happening for a long time. In Mexico, this has happened before. It's happened with politics. You do have to separate the vision as something that the state needs to take care of, and this is not political, and it has nothing to do with the political parties. It should not respond to this political partisan framework. It has to be a state approach so that we can have more reach, and it should be evolving permanently, and the system has to be separate from parties. And at the end of the day, I'm part of the government, but I'm also part of the state. And the issue may be so politically strong that people end up using it as part of their political discourse. And that's not the way it should be. That is not the way it should be, because you are defending your citizenship, you are defending your people, and the state needs to be responsible for that. So I'm going to continue. Number 3, component number 3, the social determinants.
Now, to study this, and I'll give you a brief example. This is the part that's the least looked at, because it's the one that can be measured the least. It's a very complex factor. And the social determinants, these are variables that are not security variables, but that they have an impact on security: education, health, social development, social investment, things that apparently don't have anything to do with security, but they have an impact on security. And this is key in this process, because it's good to have a good police force, and it's better when you have an area where there is economic development. If you can have a strong police, but you don't have that social development, there is the police does not have that reach and cannot fight crime effectively, because the criminal phenomenon is always going to resurge. So there's 3 components to analyze here: the social and political, what relates to education, health, and social development; then the financial and economic component, fiscal policy, economic growth, public finances, investment; then, of course, security and justice, police, the district attorneys, judges, armed forces. Now, this exercise here, to be able to work towards this vision, for 5 years we worked with several colleagues of us. We developed an indicator, an index that allows us to measure all those variables that have a direct or indirect effect on security. This index measures the 3 elements that affect security: the criminal structure and violence, the direct components of the logistic of the criminal market, corruption, and the indirect components that affect security, even though they're not directly related to security: health, education, etc. So we developed a way to measure these impacts and created benchmarks so we could study each of the variables. We have data for the last 15 years, data that measures correlations between variables, etc., and how all this impacts security and what the behavior of each variable occurred over time. That's the GLAC index. So this translates the theoretical basis of the model into a system. This uses mathematical algorithms and a database that's over 15 years old or has 15 years worth of data. So if you allow me, I'd like to show you a video, a 2-minute video that explains what this index is and what it measures in relation to all those variables that we discussed that affect security. The GLAC index generates significant information that identifies the social variables that affect the security of the nation or other entities. This is based on a mathematical algorithm based on over 900 indicators measuring their impact on society. The scale goes on a rank from 7 to -4, 7 ideal conditions of security and well-being, and -4 will be a circumstance of highest weaknesses and insecurity. This is measured using a range of colors. This is security plus well-being, security and social stability, security with limited stability, limited security with social unrest, limited security, social risks, insecurity, social instability, and institutional crisis. So there are different levels at the international level, national level, and locally. The color shows the relation between the security and social well-being. This is measured over time. So all the variables are measured in the political and social context, security and justice, and this covers police, judges, armed forces, and the financial and economic sector based on issues of fiscal policy, economic growth, and investment. All different municipalities and cities are ranked all the way down to the areas of highest vulnerability. There's a different ranking per sector, which allows to identify the behavior of each entity from the standpoint of each sector. Measuring by sector, we can see the ranking on each sector, if there's a variation in position, and the changes in the trend week by week. This three-dimensional representation here, three-dimensional graph, has 3 axes: social, political, the indicators in the security and justice, and the economic and financial axis. The system identifies the strengths and weaknesses of the entity being studied, the trend also, the behavior of the GLAC index during the previous week and the year to date. So each week we have a different score that relates security with well-being. This compares also with the local, national, international averages. The indicators are shown here in vertical bars: yellow for the political and social sector, green economic, financial, blue security and justice. Red represents the deficit of the indicator in relation to the reference variable. All of this data is compared to data obtained from national organizations, international entities, and private sources. The system identifies one or more indicators in reference to each sectors, and the information from each indicator has been compiled for over 15 years. They record the behavior, the trend of the variables over time, and its impact on the indicator. The ranking shows the entity, in this case, a city or municipality, related to the other entities. It can be international, local, national. The correlation shows the level of association or connection between the indicators. And the factors measure the impact of all of these indicators on society using big data and logistic regression models. This is also calculated using social media, and we can see also the trends, digital media, also in relation to each one of the issues analyzed by the GLAC index. The system shows the content here, the source, and the impact is measured with artificial intelligence based on historic behavior. This produces three documents: a weekly report of the GLAC index, a monthly report, and the analysis of indicators and factors. These documents show the condition of each entity in relation to security and well-being, social well-being. So this would be the factors go into the index. I can go into the system now so I can show you in real time an example. I'll show here this Mexico. I'm going to go into Mexico. There is over 800 variables to determine the indicators, taking care of, again, these three areas to look at the components that feed this whole phenomenon. And that's the challenge. How can we generate the capacity to fight crime? It's like, again, going back to the fire example, how to get to fight one of the components. And so I need to see which phenomenon I'm going to combat, which variable I need to measure. This is Mexico City. I can look at Mexico City. This index changes every day, is corrected or adjusted based on the measurement of all the factors. You can see the ranking and its magnitude also of the index. Why? Because it can be modeled, and that's something that's very important because I can identify which variables affect the index, so I can model it. What is it that I care the most about? For example, is it the police, or is it the market, or is it schools, the legal market or school or hospitals? I have to measure that to see what the impact is of that variable in the whole process. So you have the index here, the ranking. You can see today what the situation is. We can sort it by a variable per sector. For example, City of Mexico, this is number one in the ranking. If I look at just security and justice, only if I look at those variables, the ranking changes. Number one now is Yucatan, Campeche, other states. Mexico City is down to number 29. So if I look only at the economic and financial variables, number one today is Mexico City, then Nuevo León and Querétaro, following the ranking. So I can look at that process to see and to explain which variables affect the index. Now, the system also allows me to see this three-dimensionally. Look at the social variables on the G-axis, security and justice, the other axis, and then economic and financial. So I can see on which component there are weaknesses or strengths. If I picked a municipality or a city of Mexico, I can look at all the three axes, the three components, and see which components is the strongest or the weakest. And on the right here, you can see the trend, how the index is behaving week by week. Here we look at all the components by sector. For example, red is the national average. The blue, dark blue, is the entity, in this case, the city. Now, below that, and this is a real challenge, each line that you see there, each bar is an indicator. There are 885 indicators. I can pick any one I want and study it, and I can integrate them. I can look at this or make this analysis over the 15-year period to see how it affected security. And I can establish a correlation. If I pick one, for example, poverty index, poverty and lack of formal institutions. If I pick that one, for example, it shows me how the variables behave. The system is loading it now. I hope the internet connection is working well, so it's loading it there. Let's look at 15 years of how that variable behaved. You can see the indicator and then the behavior over 15 years, year by year. But something that's even more valuable, I can see, for example, the correlation between variables, which is very important. For example, in this case, informal employment and poverty. When there is a good correlation, we're talking about 0.3, 0.4. Here's 0.9, almost 1. You can see the correlation between informal employment and poverty. So that means if I move by 1 point informal employment, that moves poverty by 1.2. And you can see this, the study of the phenomenon over 15 years, mathematically studied. So every time I move that index, casual employment or informal employment, that moves the poverty index 1 point. So sometimes we tend to believe that informal employment improves the economy or helps the economy. But it's the other way around. It has an impact on poverty. Poverty increases, and that, again, has an effect on insecurity. For example, in the case Mexico, this is number 7 in the national ranking. Nuevo León is the one that's at the top. They're doing better there. The worst is Chiapas, the state of Chiapas. With this indicator, I can go down here. Well, it's still loading, so we're not there yet. Here it is. Let's say I can see here the impact. Let's say the previous ones are hard data from the last 15 years. Now, this is a different measurement here. This measures the impact of those issues on society. That's one of the advantages we have now with technology. We can measure the impact of perception in society. We had to do this by hand before. You know, we had to analyze all the media to see what each reporter said about a certain issue. Now we can look at radio, TV, printed press. All of those are in the digital environment nowadays, and we can analyze it systematically with our technology. And we can conduct mathematical studies to see what's having an impact on society. My colleagues are telling me I'm running out of time here, so thank you very much for your time, your attention.
We're going to give a few minutes to Dr. Correa-Cabrera so that she can make a few comments. And Then we're going to start with some questions, and then we will have some 20 minutes left for open conversation. Thank you. Do I do this in Spanish? Yes, it doesn't matter, whichever. Yeah. So we'll continue with the conversation in Spanish then. This presentation makes me reflect a lot regarding the current situation about security in Mexico, and I would like to just reflect. And I do have a few questions, mostly. In this regard, this idea of this decrease in the level of violence and homicide, what Engineer García Luna presented to us, what we see now in Mexico is that it starts going up again. And in the graph that we see, there is an increase in the levels of violence. And right now, what appears to happen in the last 2-3 years in Mexico, we have seen a huge increase in the number of homicides. And that is obviously an important measure, or a limited measure in a way, in order to understand what's going on. And we want to capture exactly how we're doing in Mexico. I would like to know what has happened. How can we analyze the situation, the current situation in Mexico? I think that something that's very interesting that was explained to us during the government of Felipe Calderón, this creation of a working police force. And I don't know if this has to do with the lack of results in terms of the reform to the police force. And that would be my first question then. Why is this happening? Why is this happening now? What we see right now, this increase in the level of lack of security in Mexico. And we see this in different areas of the country, especially in the Pacific area in Mexico. And how do you capture this indicator? How do you capture this transformation and this geographic movement? What happens from the Gulf to the Pacific? And also this problem, this idea that the police reform hasn't happened. It hasn't taken place, something that should have happened, or we should have been able to observe this. And what, in your opinion, would be the best model for this police force? I really am interested in the issue of security, and I think this is really important. We should reconfigure the police force. It hasn't happened so far, so I would like to know what your opinion is. What is the best model? What should be the model for the police in Mexico? And the other idea, the other thing that I would like to hear from you is what to expect with the new administration, the administration that's coming after the next election, and what will we see in Mexico? You have such a sophisticated methodology to review what's going on, and the use of big data and what you're doing and your rankings is so impressive. So what is it that we're seeing right now? I would like to hear a very general perspective about what's missing, where the problems are. And I understand that this is a huge question, and that we really should look at all the different indexes so that we review what's happening at the national level. But maybe you can give us just a very brief review so that we can identify through this new vision of security with well-being. So we would like to identify what those indicators are, and there's a big correlation between these indicators and the index, what we see on the ground. So what are the conclusions that we can reach? What is it that we're missing? Because, for instance, in Guerrero is like last place. What is going on? There is a huge decrease and a huge problem in Guerrero. So what is going on in Guerrero specifically, and how can we evaluate in general what the situation is in Mexico? Those are my initial reflections and my questions, and I would like to give everybody some time for discussion, and I would like to learn how to use this index specifically, for instance, understanding these trends. What do they tell us? What information do we get? I would like to get an example, perhaps using Guerrero as an example, and I think that's a very important state, because Guerrero right now is a state that's undergoing a very complex time. So I would like to hear what your interpretation is. We have a number of murders and fragmentation and different criminal groups, or the other example could be Tamaulipas, for instance, and that is a state that has a better economic outlook, better than Guerrero. But I would like to learn how to use this. What is the application? How can you use this information in practice? That would be a pressure. a few minutes. First of all, talking about the police force. In my experience, in terms of national security, my training was with intelligence, and in my professional capacity, I was the chief of counterintelligence, and I work on counterterrorism for the country. So my line of thought for this is we need to have a systematic approach. We cannot have something that just happens randomly, or somebody has an idea and let's do it, or it has to be an implementation of a system, something that strengthens with time, that improves with time, and that you can adjust, obviously, because you always have to improve and adjust. It has to be dynamic. In the world, there isn't one example of a police model. It has to apply to each city in every country. It has to respond to the problems that you have in each one of the countries. There are very important models that give you sort of norms and ideas. So they can give you an idea. In my experience, because of what I lived in Mexico, in the 60s, in the 70s, Mexico had low crime rates. Mexico was not violent. You would even say at the time, the media would say that it was the art of theft in Mexico. That's what we had, because that's how they call criminals in Mexico, because that was what the story was at the time. And the police forces in the world, they follow the economic movements and what governments are doing. At the time, during the 60s, during the 70s, policemen will respond more of a social control approach, more than crime itself. Because at the time, there was an argument, it was capitalism versus more socialistic movements, and each country had to develop their own model. So the police force had to follow that. So a lot of the police came from the military models, and there was an evolution of the police forces. It started in Europe, where they quickly realized that the military model that they were using for their police force had a big impact on society. It was wearing off in society, and they decided to create a national police model. It was an effort to unify and create processes. For instance, and I always use this example, in France, in Spain, they built a national police force because in an economy of scale, it's easier to unify criteria, systems, process, methodology, training, education when they use this rapid national model. And they create this inertia. It's one process. It's a lot easier and faster in an economy of scale. Now, the evolution of these models, you start seeing different agencies. They start specializing. They specialize in specific things that have to do with that approach. I'm going to create a police force that that deals with the theft of a specific item if I don't have the item. So, for instance, the mounted police in Canada, they had that specific need in Canada. Now, as a model, the evolution of police follow the national trends. In the U.S., you have specialized agencies for each type of crime. After September 11th, for instance, you know what happened then, and then they saw that there was a vacuum of integration. There was no integration. There was no communication, no sharing of information. So you have the FBI, you have the DEA, you have the different agencies, but they didn't communicate. And each agency had a specialty. It was part of the process, but with their specific task. So you have to create your own model that works for the country. For Mexico, we require, first of all, a state policy that goes beyond the political parties and the political problems. It has to be a state policy with a long-term view, an institutional view. In the second place, and when I worked as a secretary, this was very important. What we wanted to do was create or start this process of unification. And again, in an economy of scale, we wanted to have these processes that would let you work faster and to have this national police force. And we wanted to implement training, education, and control of, the trust indicators for you to be part of the police. One of the ideas that I always work with is that in Mexico, you got the idea that for you to be a policeman, you had to be it had to be the rejects, the people who nobody else wanted, people who had no jobs, people who were neglected or had no education. Those were the people that wanted to be policemen in Mexico. And I said, no, we have to change this idea. If security is so important for the country, the best people need to be part of the security system. And so I have to have a police force where I have the best representatives of society, these young people that have been educated. In order to be part of the FBI, you have to have a minimum, graduate degree. Why not do the same? I mean, why don't we say that, you have to have at least high school, you have to have higher education to be part of the police, and so that you have higher technical capacity to do things. I was explaining to, when I would talk to the House of Representatives in Mexico, and I would propose to them that, we wanted to have this very trained, high people, and I was really criticized at the time. And they said, well, why would you have a doctor to be part of the police force? And why do you need a psychologist to work with hijacking victims? And, why would you have a banker investigate money laundering? And my suggestion was, well, if you need an engineer to deal with IT crimes, for instance, and so on and so forth, that would be to the advantage of the country if we had those trained people as part of the police force. And it should be people that have other options too, instead of people with no options. It's backwards. So the effort that we implemented with Calderon, we tried to unify the police, and we tried to get a salary structure and improve the salary for the police. And, if you went to a private university, and I went to a private university, and I talked to the dean, and I asked the dean for a favor, and he said, tell me. And he said, well, I want to look for people who want to be policemen. I want people who want to be part of the force. And he said, oh, no, to come to this university, this is a very expensive place. It's the university is very expensive. The fees are high. So I'm not going to ask the parents to pay for this university so that they can become policemen. And I said, well, that's really important. And he said, well, if you want me to, he said to me, we will, set up a program. We will open a space for you. And I said, well, they gave me a space. They gave me the ability to work with their students. And this was a private university, one of the 4 more expensive universities in the country. And I was able to present to 2,000 kids, university students, and I told them, you are an example of this exercise. And if you're a graduate of this university, how much money would you make? And they said, well, at the time, about 8,000 pesos. That's what they said. That's what they were expecting to make. And I said, well, the state of Mexico is going to pay you not 8,000. We're going to pay you $12,000 to be a policeman. One question for you, young people. Do you think the person sitting next to you, look at them, if he was sitting in a patrol car, patrolling your street, or working on a hijacking or a kidnapping, would you trust them? And then they would say, of course I would trust him, and say, well, let's do that. This is going to be your salary. It's going to be 12,000 pesos. Come join us. And I was able to get, my message across to those 2,000 people first, and they joined the effort. And I was able to get the FBI to train them. And they came to agencies in the U.S. and in Europe, and then I was able to reach 7,000 people like that for, combating kidnapping, money laundering, things like that. People with their own training and specific capacity, and we just had to teach them the very specific police approach. And these were people with graduate education, with college education. And they would say, well, are these people not going to carry a gun? And I said, no, they don't need that. They just need a computer. If you're working on money laundering, if you're working on IT crimes, you do not need a gun. And, we may need the big Rambo, the people that are, 8 foot tall later on. But right now we need people who have the brains and the education. So as part of this process, that's what we did. We went to talk to the private universities, and the dean would tell me, engineer, this is a problem because a lot of people are registering for your program, and these were people that were paying big fees, people that were training to become doctors, engineers, and now they wanted to be policemen. And he said to me, the parents are complaining to me because who wants to be a policeman? And his own daughter, the dean's daughter, was a student at one of the campuses. And Genaro, my friend, told me, my daughter wants to be a policewoman. And he asked me, please say no, because I'm scared to death. And that is the example. That's the example of what we did. If we want to resolve the problem, we need to get the best of the best. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. We have to create the conditions. And for that, we had to raise the salary, so we paid 12,000 pesos. We changed the process. We offer that to these young people, and then we increase capacity to combat crime. They know information, they know how to use systems, they know how to use computers, they know IT, it's better and bigger capacity, and that's really important. The most important thing, they are part of the civil society, the society that people respect, and they respect and they trust each other. This is the people they grow up with, and these are the people that were able to reach this level of education. So this is a part of the society that genders this mutual respect and trust. So we were able to generate a lot more empathy, and we were able to do that. So in your second part, or the second part of the question was, well, what happened? Were they all fired, or what happened? And did the old policeman came back then after that? And that's exactly what happened. And so, all those people that were trained by the FBI, they were all fired. And that's what happened.
So we have to start all over again. But I think the approach is that we have to create those institutions to promote the evolution of this process. It's not a matter of luck. It's a system. We have to take care of each variable so we can have that reach, that scope. Now, your third point, the index. What's the index? Well, the index follows those variables, measures the gap, the differential, to see where those weaknesses are and where do I need to go work. And it shows me over time what the impact of that indicator was on the whole phenomenon. And so the index measures that, and I can start to work on it. Okay, well, this should be a discussion. If you have any questions, they need to use the microphone, please, if you can remind them. We cannot hear. The interpreters cannot hear.
No sé si mi pregunta está muy específica, pero me interesaba si pueden hablar por cuáles son los pasos y medidas que México está tomando para proteger el sector energético, especialmente las inversionistas que están viniendo.
The question is about the energy sector and investors coming to Mexico.
La reforma energética ya pasó y ya tenemos.
It has been a reform of the hydrocarbon law.
Tal vez quería hacer un comentario y pregunta de la doctora, ¿por qué tiene un crecimiento de enfermedades de violencia? Porque ya tiene muchos inversionistas en muchas de las reformas energéticas.
So there's an increasing violence, and this is affecting all the new investors that are taking advantage of the reform in the energy sector. Maybe we can talk about it from that standpoint. That's the question of many of my clients. If we're going to invest in Mexico, for example, or build a plant there, how can we send our employees to places like Monterrey, or where the plant's going to be built? Well, I'm not part of the government anymore. I don't have any authority. I left government in 2012. I could not give you an official answer on what the government is doing, but I think that Mexico is obligated to provide that support and that for the people who are investing, that security. So that's why I insist on using this index. As you know, there's an index for everything, many different indexes, but there's nothing that actually measures like this one, the issue of security at a global level. But in the area of energy, in the energy sector, we have to look at this context. This context that's creating new spaces for investment. But, for example, Tamaulipas, we have an increase in criminal activity, and that's the state where there are the more opportunities for investments in the energy sector. And that's why we have to look at all the variables, not just what the police need to do, but all the systems, health, education, so that we promote these opportunities for investment. So right now, I don't have that official capacity. It's not my responsibility. But when I was dealing with that, when I was in government, obviously that's something we had to do. I work in the mining sector, for example, at that time in the states of Guerrero, Acapulco, and we had to take care of making sure that we had the space for those investment opportunities and the security needed.
Bienvenido a Houston. En las gráficas que mostró, México estaba siguiendo el perfil de recuperación.
Show some graphs. Mexico followed that. There was a decrease in crime and homicide, etc., and then there was, after that dip in the trend, it started. There was a resurgence, and the index. Is there any indicators or what were the variables that resulted in that upward trend after the improvement, after the decrease? Well, this is a key issue in the general level. What happened is that, we have to maintain the rule of law, and that means strengthening the institution at all the levels of this fight against crime. By formalizing this defense, by removing this legal framework, this is actually what broke the process. The annual budget that we had for all the different sectors, that actually everything that affected the process. So the lack of this rule of law affected the structure itself. And there's also the scope and the reach of social programs to look at the origins. These are just measurements you can see in the index. You can see budgets. You can see it's not an analysis. It's just hard data. And the homicide rate. You can see that. You can see all that hard data. But I insist, in order to analyze this, to research this, and I've discussed this with Tony. That's why I love coming here to RISE. We need the academic research to study this without all the political sector interfering with this, because that's where the mistakes are made. Now, in terms of measuring hard data, I can give you, as a user, I can give you my opinion, but as far as the hard data is there. And these are official records. So a key issue now is, in order to restart the process, the state, the government, needs to have a larger or better institutional capacity, better institutions, and, measuring each variable carefully and seeing what their effect is. But we need institutional capacity to work on each one of the components. And for that, of course, it's good to have this capacity, this measurement capacity. But this is all hard data without any political component.
O sea, ¿cuál de los partidos que están como postores está haciendo énfasis?
If they can get closer to the microphones, I think there's microphones on the table. I don't carry out any political activities. I'm not a member of any party right now. President Calderon was my boss. He was a member of the PAN party, but I was never a member of a party. So, and there's no proposal so far that I have seen from any candidate saying what they're proposing to do. They're not on the table yet. Me and my colleagues in this field at the national level, we want to promote a government policy, something this is what needs to happen for the country. I don't care who the party in charge is, but I want somebody who has a long-term vision to take care of all these institutional components. And whoever the candidates are, I want them to take care of these needs. So this year, when the candidates are running, it would be, I guess, the opportunity to discuss this, to see how they're going to take care of all these variables to fight the overall problem. But so far, there hasn't been any proposal on the table by any of the candidates. There's a question here. Again, following up on the hard data. I was expecting to see a red area in the graph there on the north because of everything that's happening. I was very surprised to see that Tamaulipas has some good indicators. Well, you looked at the general index. If we, look at individual components, Tamaulipas is a very complicated state as far as security because of all the drug trafficking, because it's a border state where it's not only drug trafficking, but the migration routes and all the human trafficking. So, and Tamaulipas, with the change in government now, I think they're looking for a different focus on security. And there's something important that was done at the time when the candidate to the governorship was killed. And this was all because of the drug trafficking. Now, Tamaulipas is one of the most complex states as far as security because of all the components. There's a market, an illicit market. You have to take care of all the variables, the criminal logistics. Juarez, for example, Juarez is very important because, amongst other things, like Tamaulipas, they're like a funnel where all the criminal logistics infrastructure converges. So, if those are logistic key points for the connection to the United States for that illegal commerce. So there's a lot of commerce, there's a lot of trade, but there's also a lot of illegal commercial activities.
Right. ¿Es viable quitar ese componente, es decir, o legalizarlo o de común acuerdo con Estados Unidos, que es el consumidor más grande, de alguna manera darle otro cauce?
It's in reference to drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is a very important variable, of course. It's an issue that we need to discuss with the U.S., as you said, because the phenomenon is becoming more and more complex. There's the route north bringing drugs and going south, then back with weapons, with guns. So we need to see how to fight each one of those components with the U.S. Now, you were asking about legalizing drugs. That's a different issue. Legalizing, per se, we have studied that as an illegal market. An example, for example, the theft of fuel, for example, and illegal migration. Those two areas were so profitable that the drug cartels got involved in those areas. So now the same drug cartels are taking care of the illegal fuel market. If it's something that's profitable, they're going to get into it. Now, if drugs become, again, more profitable, they're going to go back to drugs. So the idea of legalizing drugs, well, we have to look at that in conjunction with all the other components. For example, we've been talking about marijuana and legalizing marijuana, and the marijuana trafficking was the most profitable one, the one that kept the cash flowing. Marijuana was what kept the engine running, let's say, the illegal engine running, but cocaine was then the most profitable. So we have to look at the issue globally. Again, we need to look at, as you said, at the origin, and look at the consumers. But I insist, you cannot just look at it in a linear fashion. If I legalize it, do we end all of this problem? No, we don't. So. Same thing with guns, with weapons. That's an issue that's it's terrible. But now to conclude a final question, if you allow me, there is a regulatory implication to follow up on your question. There's that comparative analysis between Medellin, Palermo, Chicago, New York, those curves. The first regulatory implication is that, first of all, you said, well, pain increases and then it decreases. In Mexico, we're at the point where the pain is increasing. And the next administration will necessarily have to face this problem again from a very low point because they did not follow up on the strengthening of institutions, etc. So at that point, we can expect the strategy deployed by the next administration, that we can expect that it will cause, again, more violence, more deaths before the curve can drop again? Or is there any strategy to rebuild the state, rebuild institutions, to if we can manage those social variables so that we don't see that curve moving up before it goes down again? Well, that's the challenge. But in the past, we didn't have the tools to evaluate this, to see this. Now we have the tools, and we need to take advantage of these tools so that that doesn't happen. You know, if we know what the components are, if we see that increase again, let's take care of those components really quickly so we don't let it go up for too long. So we need to fight each one of the components so we don't see that evolution, that increase of criminal activities for so long, so that we can, again, turn the curve downward again. So if we don't take care of the variables, that process is going to occur again in the same fashion. So it's like medication. Again, you have a fever, there may be a strong reaction first. If you stop taking the medication, fever is going to go up again. So now that we have those indicators for all those variables, we have to take care of them very quickly so that the fever doesn't increase. Okay, thank you very much for being here with us.